The chandelier lights gleamed over the polished marble floor, casting a golden glow across the luxurious restaurant. Soft music drifted in the background, blending seamlessly with the quiet hum of conversation. Every detail of Le Chateau, one of the most exclusive dining spots in the city, screamed refinement. From the perfectly folded napkins to the impeccably dressed guests sipping on vintage wine. At the entrance, a woman stepped inside, pausing for a moment to take in the atmosphere. Her blonde hair was tucked under a simple baseball cap, and an oversized hoodie draped over her frame. Faded jeans and well-worn sneakers completed the look, an outfit that, in any other setting, would have been unremarkable. But here, amidst silk dresses and tailored suits, she stood out like a misplaced note in a flawless melody. She approached the hostess stand with a quiet confidence, her gaze warm yet observant. The young hostess barely spared her a glance before plastering on a tight-lipped smile. "Good evening," the woman said politely. "Could I get a table for one?" The hostess hesitated. She swept her eyes over the woman's casual attire, her expression flickering between skepticism and mild amusement. "I'm afraid we're fully booked for the evening," she said smoothly, tapping her manicured nails against the podium. The woman tilted her head slightly. She had checked the reservations online before arriving. There were still open tables. "Oh," she said unfazed. "I don't mind waiting." Before the hostess could reply, another voice cut in. "Is there a problem?" A waitress had appeared beside them, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. A name tag pinned to her chest read Chloe. "Not really," the hostess replied lightly, lowering her voice. "She's just looking for a table." Chloe's lips curled ever so slightly. "Here," she murmured under her breath, just loud enough for the woman to hear. A flicker of something, annoyance? Amusement passed through the woman's blue eyes, but she simply offered a small, patient smile. "I can pay," she added, her voice calm. Chloe scoffed, folding her arms. "Look, I don't think this is the place for casual diners. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at the cafe down the street?" A couple at a nearby table glanced over, intrigued by the exchange. The woman felt their eyes on her, but remained composed. "I'd still like a table," she repeated. Chloe exchanged a glance with the hostess, suppressing a smirk. "Right. I'll check with the manager," she said, turning on her heel. But instead of heading toward the back, she stopped by a nearby table, where a well-dressed older gentleman sat alone, sipping his whiskey. "Excuse me, sir," she said lightly. "This lady seems to think she belongs here. What do you think?" A hush fell over the nearby tables. The woman remained still, her expression unreadable, as all eyes turned toward the older man. And then, very slowly, he set down his glass and looked up. The moment was about to shift. The restaurant, usually a place of hushed conversations and the clinking of silverware, had grown noticeably quieter. The waitress stood with an expectant look, a satisfied glint in her eye as she waited for the older gentleman's response. She assumed he would play along, that he would dismiss the casually dressed woman with the same air of superiority she had. But instead of an immediate response, he studied the scene before him, his gaze shifting from the waitress to the woman standing at the entrance, her hands tucked into the front pocket of her hoodie. His expression remained unreadable as he took his time, fingers lightly tapping against the rim of his whiskey glass. His patience, his silence, unnerved Chloe just enough for her confident stance to falter. "She asked for a table," he finally said, his voice even, neither confrontational nor kind, but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "That means she's a guest here, just like anyone else." He leaned back slightly, glancing at the waitress with a quiet intensity. "Unless, of course, you have some kind of policy against serving people who don't fit your personal standards." Chloe stiffened at the unexpected shift, her lips pressing together as the murmurs of nearby diners grew louder. A few turned their heads back toward their meals, pretending to be uninterested, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The woman in the hoodie, still standing by the hostess stand, remained expressionless, her gaze steady, as if waiting to see how much further the situation would unravel before her. "Sir, I was just trying to maintain the standards of the restaurant," Chloe said quickly, though the confidence in her voice had wavered. We have a certain level of clientele, and we? You mean people who dress a certain way, the man interrupted, his eyes narrowing just slightly, the way a teacher might look at a student who had given a disappointing answer. I see. Well, I've been coming here for years, and I don't recall ever reading a rule about how a guest has to dress to be treated with respect. He turned his gaze back to the woman. And I assume she hasn't caused any trouble, hasn't raised her voice, hasn't demanded anything unreasonable, correct? Chloe hesitated. She knew exactly where this was going. The power she had felt moments ago, the quiet delight of watching an outsider squirm, was slipping away rapidly. No, sir, she said reluctantly. Good, the man said, nodding slightly before turning back to his drink. Then I suggest you do your job and seat her. The words landed with finality. Chloe's face burned, not just from embarrassment, but from the realization that she had miscalculated the situation entirely. She had expected support, had expected the older gentleman to sneer along with her, to confirm that this woman didn't belong. But instead, he had flipped the entire moment against her, making her look like the unreasonable one. And to make matters worse, the other guests had clearly taken note of it. The hostess, shifting uncomfortably at the podium, cleared her throat and reached for a menu. We do have a table available, she murmured quickly, as if trying to smooth over the situation before it escalated further. If you'd like to follow me. For the first time since stepping into the restaurant, the woman in the hoodie moved. She took a slow step forward, but before following the hostess, she turned slightly toward Chloe. Her expression remained calm, no trace of smugness or satisfaction. If anything, there was a quiet curiosity in her eyes, as if she were observing rather than reacting. Thank you, she said, her voice just as even and polite as when she had first walked in. There was nothing else. No sharp remark, no pointed look of victory. Just those two words before she followed the hostess toward her table, leaving Chloe standing there, her stomach twisting with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just embarrassment, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper, something uncomfortable, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. As the woman sat down, the buzz of conversation in the restaurant slowly resumed. Chloe exhaled sharply, forcing herself to shake off the moment as she turned away, though the weight of it still clung to her. She needed to compose herself. She needed to prove that this interaction had meant nothing, that she was still in control. With a sharp turn, she strode toward the back of the restaurant, her mind racing. She didn't even notice the restaurant manager step into the dining area until it was too late. Chloe barely had time to process the sudden shift in atmosphere before the restaurant manager stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet authority. He was a tall man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanding without the need for raised voices or unnecessary gestures. He wasn't someone who spoke often, but when he did, people listened. As he made his way toward the front, the staff straightened instinctively, sensing that something was about to unfold. The moment he spotted the woman who had just been seated, his entire posture changed. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and without a second's hesitation, he walked directly toward her. The waitstaff exchanged glances, confusion flickering between them. The guests who had been subtly following the situation quieted, their curiosity deepening. Chloe, still rattled from her previous interaction, froze in place, her mind working to understand why the manager had taken such an immediate interest. "Miss Swift," the manager said, stopping beside the woman's table, his voice smooth but carrying a distinct note of respect that hadn't been present in Chloe's own interactions with her. "It's a pleasure to see you again. I wasn't aware you were visiting tonight." At the sound of her name, several guests reacted visibly, a few heads turning sharply, whispers spreading across the room like an electric current. The casual woman in the hoodie, the one Chloe had dismissed without a second thought, the one she had deliberately humiliated, was Taylor Swift. The realization hit like a weight dropping in her chest. Taylor, who had remained composed throughout the entire ordeal, offered a small nod to the manager. "I was in town and thought I'd stop by," she said simply, her tone as natural as if she were discussing the weather. "Didn't think it would cause this much trouble." The manager's expression darkened just slightly, enough for those who were watching closely to notice. He turned his head just enough to glance toward Chloe, his gaze sharp but unreadable. "There should never be trouble for you here," he said, his voice polite but carrying a firm edge. "I sincerely apologize if your experience has been anything less than perfect." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face, her throat tightening as every second stretched unbearably long. The weight of what she had done, what she had assumed, settled in her stomach like a leaden stone. She had treated her like a nuisance, mocked her in front of others, dismissed her as if she were nothing, all because she hadn't fit the mold of the kind of customer Chloe believed belonged here. And now, the entire restaurant knew. Taylor, however, didn't react with smugness or anger. She didn't even look at Chloe directly. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable. "No need for an apology," she said calmly. "I get it. People make judgments. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But what matters is what happens after that." The room was deathly quiet, all eyes on the scene unfolding. Chloe felt her chest tighten, her breath unsteady. Taylor's words weren't just casual observations. They were pointed, deliberate, not meant to humiliate, but to make her realize exactly how badly she had miscalculated. The way Taylor had chosen not to lash out, not to retaliate, made it even worse. If she had gotten angry, if she had caused a scene, Chloe could have justified her actions in some way, told herself she had been right to be wary of her. But this quiet grace, this undeniable proof of character, made her actions feel inexcusable. The manager exhaled slowly before speaking again, his voice steady but firm. "Chloe," he said, finally addressing her directly, "I'd like a word with you. Now." A few staff members exchanged glances, some looking away, others watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Chloe's entire body felt like it was burning, every step toward the back of the restaurant feeling heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of judgment in the air, not from Taylor, not even necessarily from the manager, but from herself. Chloe followed the manager toward the back of the restaurant, her steps slow, deliberate, as if she were walking towards something inevitable. The whispers behind her faded into the background, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her with every second that passed. When they reached the small hallway near the staff lounge, the manager turned sharply, his face unreadable, his arms crossed in a way that made it clear he was not interested in excuses. The sound of the dining area was now muffled, creating an isolating silence between them. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was calm but heavy, carrying none of the usual sharpness of an outright reprimand, yet somehow making her feel even smaller than if he had shouted. Chloe knew there was no point in pretending she didn't understand. She shifted uncomfortably, her hands clenched at her sides. "I didn't know who she was," she admitted, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how weak they sounded. The manager didn't blink. And if she weren't Taylor Swift? If she were just some regular customer? Would that have made your behavior acceptable? Chloe's stomach twisted at the question. She had expected the focus to be on the fact that she had treated someone famous poorly, but instead, the manager had turned it into something worse. He wasn't just angry because she had humiliated an important guest. He was angry because her actions had revealed something deeper about how she viewed people. "I just thought," she started, but the words died in her throat. What had she thought? That someone dressed casually didn't belong? That they deserved less respect? That she had the right to decide who was worthy of good service? "I don't care how you justify it to yourself," the manager continued, his voice unwavering. "This restaurant prides itself on the experience we provide. Not just for the wealthy, not just for the powerful, but for every single person who walks through that door. And you made someone feel like they didn't belong here, based on nothing but your own assumptions." Chloe swallowed hard, but the dryness in her throat made it impossible to speak. She had spent so much time believing she understood the dynamics of the restaurant, knowing which guests mattered, which ones deserved attention. It had been easy, instinctual even, to cater to the ones who looked important while brushing off the ones who didn't fit the image she had constructed in her mind. And yet, in a single evening, that entire mindset had shattered in front of her. She started again, then stopped, her voice failing her. The apology was there, somewhere beneath the tangled mess of pride and shame, but it wouldn't come out. The manager studied her for a moment, then exhaled, his expression shifting into something that resembled disappointment more than anger. "Go home for the night," he said finally. "I don't want you on the floor right now." Her breath caught slightly, but she nodded, unable to argue. As she turned to leave, the weight in her chest only grew heavier. Chloe stepped out into the cool night air, the automatic doors shutting behind her with a soft click. The noise from the restaurant was gone, replaced by the distant hum of the city. She had been sent home before, but never like this. This wasn't about a simple mistake or a forgotten order. It wasn't about a customer being difficult or a minor oversight in service. This was different. This had forced her to confront something she hadn't wanted to see. She stood motionless for a long moment, her thoughts tangled in the night's events. The way Taylor Swift had handled everything with patience instead of anger, how she had refused to react in the way Chloe had expected, the way the older man had spoken up, cutting through the moment with words that had exposed the situation for what it was. And then the way the manager had looked at her, his disappointment settling heavier on her shoulders than any lecture could. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides before she forced herself to take a breath and walk. There was no point in standing outside the restaurant like some lost child. She needed to clear her head. As she moved down the sidewalk, she pulled out her phone instinctively, scrolling mindlessly through social media before stopping on a post that made her stomach twist. Taylor Swift, sitting at the restaurant, a blurry photo taken by someone who had clearly recognized her too late. The caption underneath was simple: "Taylor Swift dines at Le Chateau," unnoticed at first. The comments were already piling up. Some people laughed about how she had blended in, how no one had recognized her immediately. Others speculated about how she had been treated before people realized who she was. Chloe swallowed, her thumb hovering over the screen before she locked her phone and shoved it back into her pocket. She had humiliated herself, yes, but worse than that, she had humiliated someone who hadn't deserved it. And for what? Because she thought she could tell at a glance who mattered and who didn't? Because she had assumed that expensive clothes and polished appearances were the only indicators of importance? Her feet carried her farther down the street before she stopped outside a small cafe, one of the ones she had so casually dismissed earlier that night when she had tried to push Taylor Swift toward it instead of seating her. The lights inside were warm. The people at the tables dressed in everything from business suits to sweatpants, talking and laughing, completely unconcerned with whether they belonged or not. She hesitated only for a second before stepping inside, the quiet chime of the door signaling her arrival. The barista looked up from behind the counter with an easy smile. "What can I get for you?" Chloe exhaled, rolling her shoulders back as she pulled out her wallet. "Just a coffee," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. As she waited, she glanced around the cafe, watching how the servers moved between tables, how they spoke to customers with genuine warmth, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. She wondered if she had ever truly done that, or if she had spent her entire time at the restaurant chasing an image, treating people based on the roles she thought they played instead of who they actually were. The barista slid the coffee toward her with a nod, and as she took it, she let out a slow breath. There was no undoing what had happened that night, no erasing the mistake she had made. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to define her.